This video will contain spoilers for Telltale Games' Game of Thrones series, as well as general spoilers for the Game of Thrones TV show and maybe the books. This is House Forrester. They're a little-known house in the north, Bannermen of Bannermen to the Starks, as all loyal northern houses are. They are proud, noble, and destined to meet a tragic end at the hands of their neighbors. In Telltale Games, a Game of Thrones adventure game, we will play as them, see the world through their eyes, and then watch in escalating horror as they meet one terrible fate after another. I played this game for the first time at the end of 2023 whilst on vacation, and let me tell you, it was quite a wild ride. From start to finish, it was exciting, engaging, and tragic in many ways. When I had finished the finale, it really left me in quite a state. I would be so bold as to suggest that this is probably the best that Telltale have to offer. Well, had to offer. Telltale Games went bankrupt, and you can no longer legally purchase this game via things like Steam. I was fortunate enough to play it on a PS4 with an actual physical disc on hand. The sadder reality is that this game ends on a cliffhanger of sorts. While the main story does wrap up, there are many dangling plot threads that will never be resolved. Technically, LCG Entertainment owns the assets to many of Telltale's products, but they have yet to materialize interest in creating a sequel to anything, especially this game. So when I had finished this game, I naturally went to look online for opinions, for discussion, for further analysis, and I didn't really find much. It's not a perfect game, but as a fan of A Song of Ice and Fire, I found it to be an incredible experience. That being said, the game is not without its detractors. One recurring theme in the criticism is that the game is pointless, that despite your efforts, House Forrester is doomed, and thus nothing that you can do makes any point. The game says you're going to struggle and struggle and struggle, and try as you might, you can't save them. It's those comments that actually inspired me to make this video, because I not only think that is bad criticism, but I think it gives me a great framing device to talk about this story and why I think it's worth discussing. As a reminder, I will be spoiling this game, in at least the high-level details, and maybe some other parts about the wider Game of Thrones story. So, with that said, let me introduce the Forresters. The Forresters are a noble house in the north. They're sworn to the Glovers, who are in turn sworn to the Starks. So they're not necessarily major players, being bannermen to bannermen, but they are an interesting house because they're custodians of a rare and precious resource, ironwood. Ironwood is an important resource in the feudal society of Westeros because ironwood trees have special material properties. Ironwood doesn't burn very easily, and it's much tougher than normal wood, so naturally it makes for great shields and ships. Its use in shields is demonstrated several times throughout the story. I don't have to tell you that several realms would really very much love to have access to ironwood as a resource. In the past, there used to be two houses, the Forresters and the Whitehills, who have managed the ironwood forests. But the Whitehills were irresponsible stewards, and cut down or mismanaged the forests until they were lost. From their seat, Ironrath, House Forrester is therefore a small but capable house in the north that sits on a very potentially lucrative treasure. At the start of the game, the family tree looks as follows. The lord of the house is Gregor Forrester, or Gregor the Good as he's so called. His wife is Lady Alyssa Branfeld. The Branfelds were once Targaryen loyalists whose house was destroyed when that dynasty fell, something which of course is meant to foreshadow for the future of this story. Together they have 6 children. Roderick is the eldest son, the heir of the house, and probably the most like his father. He even wears a similar armor to Gregor when we see him don it. He's a stoic military man, and he's clearly being groomed to take up the duty as lord when Gregor passes. Asher Forrester is the second-born son, and while a great fighter, his relationship with his parents is more strained. Asher is currently exiled to Essos because he fell in love with Gwyn Whitehill against the wishes of his parents, and he left to keep the peace. He's been a sellsword ever since. Mira Forrester is the eldest daughter, and like many noble girls of her age, she is serving as a handmaiden in the employ of another woman, specifically Marjorie Tyrell. Therefore, she is at King's Landing when the events of the game unfold, and will be separated from her family for the rest of the game. Talia and Ethan are the next children. They're young teens, and they're twins. Where Roderick and Asher are warlike, Ethan is quiet and sensitive. He and his sister are fond of music. In a feudal world like Westeros, it's unlikely Ethan would have much in the way of power or responsibility, being the third-born son, but of course that can change in the blink of an eye. The last kid is Ryan Forrester, who is a young kid and unfortunately not really well developed as a character, given what will happen to him. In terms of the game, we get to play as Roderick, Asher, Ethan, Mira, and of course, a squire of the house, Gerard Tuttle. Tuttle is an interesting character in the sense that he is an outsider to the house. He's not strictly part of the family, but he clearly holds the Forresters dear, and we can see the value that he places in the Forresters as his newfound family, especially over the course of the game. We can see, especially in him, how others see his house, and how he sees his own place in it, especially as the story unfolds. Interestingly enough, Tuttle is the only character who cannot actually canonically die over the course of the game. Yes, he can die if you fail the QuickTime events, but he can't actually die as part of the story. His character arc is also a lot more traditional in terms of the fantasy arcs that you might see in this kind of story, and we'll get to that later when we get to it. But what's interesting about this setup is that these different characters all have different struggles and goals and desires and skills, and yet their lives all intersect because they're part of the same family, and thus, of course, the same broader struggle. Roderick is the Lord Apparent, and when you play as him, you have to manage the estate and make decisions. He's also a warrior, so you get to do plenty of action QuickTime events. Mira, by contrast, is a woman in a society that doesn't really place much value on women as warriors. So her story is more about navigating political intrigues that could save her family or not, depending on her success. She is isolated both physically and emotionally. There's a very lovely contrast between the physically cold but honest North against the warm but very guarded and sometimes duplicitous South. Northerners might seem uncouth, but they speak what they mean. Numerous times you'll be confronted directly by the game's northern antagonists who just outright say that they'll murder you. Contrast that against the people in King's Landing. Everyone has a smile, everyone claims to be your friend, but in the end, no one has your back, and Mira is almost entirely alone against the forces that she, as a teenager, has very little recourse against. The family dynamic is compelling because we get different perspectives, different types of narrative experiences, and ultimately, different types of stories in the wider context of Westeros. It's a great way to fill in the map of what lives are like in Westeros without having to rely on the TV show. But, of course, with the background out the way, I'd like to give a brief overview of the story as itself before I start providing some counter-arguments to the idea about why the story doesn't matter. Okay, so this is a relatively long game split up into 6 episodes. In each episode, we get to play from multiple perspectives, usually following through what plot beats established in the previous episode. As this is a Telltale game, you can choose various choices in dialogue, and your choices will affect whether certain future dialogue options, certain resources or means you might have, or even which characters might be alive at a given moment. So I'm going to provide a very basic plot outline of the most important events. There are other videos on YouTube that you can go to watch to see the entire story in more detail. I'm mostly going to be trying to provide some analysis here. So, our story starts with Gerard Tuttle, who is serving as a squire for Lord Gregor. Gregor, Roderick, and soldiers of their house are currently decamped after having ridden south with Robb Stark. Unfortunately for them, they happen to be camped out at the night of the Red Wedding. Naturally, as Stark loyalists, when the swords start flying, the Forresters are attacked, Roderick dies, and Gregor is seemingly killed as well, but not before giving Tuttle his ancestral sword to return back to Ironrath. In the process of going home, Gerard ends up killing some Bolton/Whitehill men who had just killed his own father and sister. This is the casus belli for Lord Ludd Whitehill to start antagonizing the Forresters. The Boltons are the new wardens in the north, and Ludd has been trying to side with them in order to finally destroy the Forresters, whom he hates ferociously. Ethan is made Lord of the House, as he is the next son, although everyone is uncertain about this, given his young age. The Forresters also have 2 loyal retainers, Duncan Tuttle, Gerard's uncle and the current castellan of the castle, and Royland de Gore, the Master of Arms. Both men do not like each other and have opposing viewpoints of how to deal with the Whitehill crisis. Duncan favors diplomacy, while Royland favors aggression, and this leads to a lot of tension in the household. War is potentially on the horizon, and with the loss of their lord and many soldiers, the Forresters are in a precarious position. Furthermore, Geralt is sent to the Wall to try and pacify the Whitehills, while Malcolm, Alyssa's brother, is sent to Essos to try and find Asher and possibly help for the house. From here, there are essentially 4 separate stories: Asher's quest in Essos, Mira's struggles in King's Landing, Gerard's adventures at the Wall, and the main struggle at Ironrath. I'll provide a summary for each of them. Gerard's story is the most disconnected from the main events of the game. After his fight, he is sent to the Wall. While this is supposed to be a lifetime appointment, Gerard was told by Gregor, and then later Duncan, about something called the North Grove. This is a secret ironwood grove that's somewhere up north of the Wall. So he endeavors to try and find it as a way of trying to help the house. Along the way, he'll get into battles with his fellow brothers at the Night's Watch, meet Jon Snow, escape beyond the Wall, and then subsequently, after a lot of bungling, including with a bit of a bear, he'll find the North Grove. It turns out that the North Grove is a secret wildling community inside of an ironwood forest. It's led by Gregor's illegitimate children, Jacaera and Alcera Snow. Of course, this is something that is news to both the player and Geralt. Everyone thought that Gregor was an honorable man, but to find out that he has illegitimate children, that's a huge blow to the system. You're not wrong for seeing any parallels with Ned Stark, but I digress. This community of wildlings is under attack by ice wights, and they're faced with a very uncertain future. Geralt can either lead these people back south to help Ironrath, or he can opt to stay north and defend the North Grove, both of which carry narrative consequences you can imagine for the future. If he vows to stay, the North Grove might be preserved, but it would be a difficult struggle, and especially it would mean that they would have to abandon Ironrath. If they bring the wildlings south, that could potentially mean support for Ironrath, maybe even new soldiers to help fight. But Tuttle has no idea what the state of Ironrath is, and he also doesn't realize how the wildlings might be perceived in the south. Prejudices might fly, and things might come to a head. But his story is largely self-contained. Like I said earlier, he's the only character who is guaranteed to actually survive until the end. This makes his story a lot more traditional in a fantasy sense, as he goes on a hero's journey. He has to cross a literal threshold in order to actualize himself as a real hero. And of course, there is the fact that he becomes sort of the leader of this community, deciding their fate at the end. But, of course, it's very disconnected from the rest of the story. In fact, most of the characters don't even know what's happening to Tuttle, while the rest of their stories are carrying on. Mira's stories, by contrast, are a lot less fantastical than Geralt's. Her struggle is largely about trying to navigate the politics of King's Landing. Mira is caught between largely two desires: preserving her standing at court, and especially her favor with Marjorie, and also trying to use what connections she has to get help for her family back up north. Mira will try many avenues to protect her family, negotiating with her friend Sarah Flowers, and also with Marjorie and other characters. I find her interactions with Tyrion Lannister to be the most entertaining of all. Of course, depending on how good you are at political maneuvering, this might be for the better or for the worse. Importantly for her, however, she uncovers a plot from some unknown ironwood merchant who is trying to raise a sellsword army with money, and that will allow them to persecute the war back home with their family. So naturally, she decides that she has to unravel this plot, and in the process of unraveling it, she'll lose her favor at court. Marjorie then subsequently falls out of favor because of the purple wedding and some other things involving Cersei, and then Mira will discover, of course, gasp, that Rickard Morgan was actually the guy behind the conspiracy against her family. She can either submit to him in a marriage, so that Rickard can secure her family's noble claims and also claims to the Ironwood, or she can refuse and be executed for the killing of a guard that tried to kill her at Rickard's behest. Mira's story is interesting because she is a northerner in a southern realm, so we get to see her perspective on the different types of politics that traditionally the northerners don't engage in. We also get to see political intrigues and struggle in the wider part of the Game of Thrones world, as we're getting to see perspectives of the most powerful characters like Cersei, Tyrion, Marjorie, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately for Mira, she's a teenager who has very few resources at her beck and call. One of the things that's constantly in tension about her is her family are desperately trying to get her to help, but her actual means of trying to get help are extremely limited. She can try to ask Marjorie, but that is probably going to be fraught, because Marjorie is also in a similar position trying to deal with pressures from both Cersei, Joffrey, and other characters. She can try to maybe do a little bit of political maneuvering, such as disrupting the Ironwood merchant, but that only just paints a target on her back, one that she's ill-equipped to deal with because, again, she's not a very powerful political figure. She's a handmaiden of someone who could be queen. Of course, we know that that doesn't happen, but still, it's interesting to see her try to navigate and negotiate this world. There's only really one combat encounter, one quick-time event that makes up the crux of the game, and that's when Mira kills the guard who's trying to kill her. But for the most part, it really is just a test of how well you can understand characters' motivations, how well you can interpret social cues, and how well you can play the metaphorical Game of Thrones. Asher, the prodigal son, is in exile, a mercenary living for coin and battle in Essos. He has a partnership with Beshka, a former slave fighter, and together they kill for coin and merriment. Malcolm arrives with the dire news of the house, and he implores Asher to bring help to House Forrester, presumably by trying to buy a sellsword army to help the house from afar. With Daenerys on the warpath in Essos, she has basically taken up all of the contracts of all of the mercenary companies, so these three head to Meereen to possibly try and find mercenaries. Unfortunately for them, the path to acquiring mercenaries involves negotiating a deal with Daenerys. The contract is simple. Help Daenerys take the city, and she will provide them with mercenaries. However, despite fulfilling to various levels of success depending on the player's ability Daenerys' quest, there are actually no mercenaries, as Daenerys has basically taken up all of the contracts and refuses to part with any of them. You can, in theory, get some gold to help you here, but regardless, Beshka basically points out that there is another option. She knows of a company of former gladiators, and they can be convinced to take up arms for Asher. Naturally, this involves fighting one of their champions, which Asher manages to defeat, and when he defeats the champion, he is able to galvanize the gladiators into becoming a mercenary army of sorts for him. Malcolm stays behind to help Daenerys, and Asher and his mercenaries head to Westeros to save his family. This, I think, is a high point of the story, because this actually represents the hope. The prodigal son, Asher, is coming back to his family. At this point, the family has suffered some potentially serious losses. The mercenaries represent a small amount of hope. Maybe they can actually turn the tide, because for once, maybe the Forresters will actually have an army instead of other people who are around them. But of course, this intersects perfectly now with talking about the main story. Okay, so jumping back in time. With the death of Gregor and Roderick, young Ethan is appointed as the Lord of Ironrath. The Whitehills, the ancestral enemy of the Forresters, want blood for the death of the soldiers caused by Geralt, but by sending them to the Wall, they have averted any trial. Lud Whitehill, the clan patriarch, hates the Forresters, and he's dead set upon destroying their house. War is coming, and the Forresters are caught unprepared. While Ethan does his best, everyone is nervous about his age and lack of experience. Unfortunately, he never really earns a chance to prove himself, as Ramsay Snow, the worst guy in the world, arrives at Ironrath to get the Forrester fealty on behalf of the Boltons. In typical worst guy in the world fashion, he upsets his hosts, takes half of the Forrester ironwood for the Whitehills, and kills Ethan in cold blood. Compounding matters, Ryan is also taken as a hostage for the Whitehills. All seems lost until Roderick, who is barely alive, is delivered to the castle on a corpse cart. Brought back to life by the Maester, he is placed in charge as the legitimate lord, and he tries to defend his house as best as he can, potentially marrying his childhood sweetheart, Elena Glenmore, who is the daughter of another northern house that Roderick could ally with as a bulwark against the Whitehills and possibly even the Boltons. However, these efforts are merely able to forestall destruction until, of course, Asher can come back with the mercenaries, which, of course, he does, their two stories now intersecting back into the main one. Unfortunately for all of them, when Roderick comes to meet Asher, the Whitehills have arranged an ambush, and during this fight, this most desperate of struggles, Roderick or Asher is killed by buying time for the other to leave. It's an incredibly dramatic, incredibly sad moment to watch either Roderick, who's just coming back to full recovery, or Asher, who we've just come to see and know and love, sacrifice themselves so that the other person can get out of the ambush that has been set for them. From there, it's the endgame. The surviving lord rallies their house for the final confrontation with the Whitehills. They can choose to launch their own ambush, try to kill Lud Whitehill in a faux surrender ceremony a la their own Red Wedding, or they can try to make a genuine effort at peace, which fails because Elisa Branfield is so traumatized with losses inflicted upon her house that she tries to kill Lud Whitehill anyway. Regardless of the options, a fight breaks out and the castle will fall. The lord you chose will survive, but barely, and only a few of the other named characters possibly make it out alive, depending on the situation that you've chosen. Ironrath will burn regardless. So, that's the story. Now to get into why it's not really pointless. Okay, so before I give my counter-arguments, I think it's best to define what someone might mean when they say the story is pointless. What's being hinted at here is the idea that our story is pointless because nothing the characters can do can fundamentally change the outcome of the story. The Forresters are destined to die, no matter how successful the player is at navigating the perils and obstacles of the story. The first counter-argument that I have is probably the most obvious one. Simply, you don't know that the first time you play. You don't know that the struggle is doomed. You might have an inkling of it, and the game certainly hints that the struggle might be doomed, but you don't know that until the very final confrontation. That was literally me the first time I was playing this game. I got swept up in the moment of trying my very level best to save the Forresters. As the game went on, it started to dawn on me that the Forresters weren't really going to have an easy time managing things. As they got closer to the sword of Damocles actually falling on them, I felt a much more heightened sense of tension. It made for a genuinely emotional experience. This, I would argue, is necessary to deliver on the story beats that it wanted to tell. Remember, a story is not purely logical events and sequences, it's also emotions that people feel as these events are transpiring. Sometimes it might necessarily be the case that you want to express more of the emotional appeal than you would the logical appeal. And I certainly think that there are arguments either way, but I certainly don't think it's as simple as the story is pointless because we can't save them. It's also not necessarily true that nothing that we do matters. Yes, it is not possible to stop the house from falling, but depending on the choices that you've made, the actual context and specific details can be very different. Mira, one of the most important characters, can be alive or dead. For example, the house could have fallen easily or it could have been completely stubborn to the last. History and you can get a sense of how you wanted to shape this destiny of this house. And yes, this is a story of big events, but it's also about the people. You have to remember that while you don't have a lot of freedom to change the wider story, the house is going to fall, that's been set in stone, you have an immense amount of freedom to change the relationships of people in the house itself, and of course outside. This story is more about the people's relationships with each other than it necessarily is about the wider context of the disaster befalling them. The disaster is going to happen. The question is, how are the people changed by it? Are they hardened by it? Are they made more cruel? Or do they try to cling to their humanity, to cling to their nobility, even in the face of great struggle? This matters, because it means that the characters that the story ends with are not going to be the characters that the story starts with. That is growth, that is progression, and that is storytelling. This, of course, is further reinforced by the themes of the series as a whole. A Song of Ice and Fire is not necessarily a feel-good happy story. It never has been. It's always been about the dangers of power, its consequences for the people, both great and small. The Forresters are not a big house. They're bannermen of bannermen. They're not the Starks or the Lannisters or anyone else. They're a small house that has managed to survive the landscape that is Westeros. By holding to their codes and their crafts, they've become indispensable to the North. But they're not a big player, and as we soon see in the story, once a big player pays attention to them, they're not as powerful as we want them to be. Certainly they're not as powerful as they want to be. Something that I would always bring up in the story is that of Royland, the Master-at-Arms. He is a force of aggression in the story, but it's comical almost when you think about it, just how needlessly aggressive he actually is, and just how hopelessly outmatched the house actually is. Royland favors aggression, but from the outside looking in, it's a hopeless cause. Duncan, by contrast, favors diplomacy, but we also learn that it's a hopeless cause, in that sense, because the forces arrayed against them are not receptive to diplomacy. Navigating this struggle is about finding the balance, about threading that needle between these different forces and seeing how they relate to other people. If you push Lud Whitehill, will he actually snap and kill your hostage? Or are you able to talk him down because you understand, maybe, at the heart of his cold exterior, there might be just a kernel of goodness that you could rely on, a kernel of familial loyalty that you yourself might feel towards the Forresters. But most importantly, House Forrester is not a huge power in the North. They survived because they were loyal and useful to the Starks. Political power plays are the name of this game, almost literally. So when your side loses that play, they lose that game, there are consequences to that. Characters like Mira exemplify that. She's told consistently that the Forresters are in a precarious position. They were Stark loyalists. They were hated by members loyal to the new Bolton regime. They're weakened, and when you're weak, other people will pounce on you. That's how it is, social Darwinism, etc., etc. Mira can try and maneuver her way through politics, but she's not the daughter of a house that can really back her up. Even Marjorie, who's going to be the queen, is still bound by concerns and problems of other people placing limits on her. Yes, there are exceptionally evil characters like the worst guy in the world, Ramsay Snow, or Cersei Lannister, but these people are not the exception in feudalism. They're closer to the norm. So the Forresters are paying the consequences for their loyalty to the Starks because that's something that's really valuable to them, and something that's really valuable to people at that time. They just didn't realize that there would be consequences. They couldn't have foreseen that the Red Wedding would happen. Another theme, of course, is the cycle of vengeance. The Forrester-Whitehill feud should immediately draw comparisons between the Blackwood-Bracken feud. It's an extremely serious feud between two smaller noble houses that compels even children to engage in violence against each other. In a society obsessed with ideas like honor, status, and titles, noble families often go to war over stupid things. We know they're stupid, but they still do that because human behavior is never perfectly rational, and sometimes your emotions get the better of you. Even things that are ultimately ephemeral, like honor, in contrast to real suffering, will ultimately triumph sometimes what people want to do. I do think one of the major points of criticism that I would levy at this game is that Lud Whitehill is almost too unlikable. Ramsay Snow, the worst guy in the world, was always going to be unlikable given his origin, but Lud Whitehill almost has no redeeming qualities. He's entirely boorish, hateful, and spiteful almost from the moment you meet him. His hatred of the Forresters is very one-dimensional, and I don't think the game really gives him enough dimensionality to his character to explain why he hates them so much, or whether or not his cause is actually legitimate. From everything that we see, especially from our perspective as Forresters, Lud Whitehill is objectively in the wrong. Garrod was, from what we can tell from our perspective of morality, correct for trying to attack the people who killed his family. Lud Whitehill doesn't care anyway. They're stupid peasants, whereas soldiers were killed. So he's just incredibly unlikable, and he very rarely has moments of characterization beyond that. I think if the game wanted to be stronger, and perhaps maybe play better to some of the themes, they needed to reinforce that he's not actually as bad as the game portrays him out to be. He needed to have more moments of humanization, more moments of, oh, I shouldn't actually be pushing these people, right? Because one of the things that you could say about this game is that it's a great demonstration of what happens when people are cornered. When push comes to shove, if you push people into a corner, they will lash out at you. And Lud Whitehill seems extremely surprised that this happens. He just expects the Foresters to roll over and die, but they're not going to do that. And so I think if they really wanted to make the game better, they should have enhanced on that aspect as well. But that's not to say that it's not entirely unreasonable either. Greedy, self-centered, boorish, evil people exist, and they often have positions of power and authority, and they misuse them all the time. Lud is just another example cast in the archetype of lords that A Song of Ice and Fire has shown us time and time again are representative samples of leadership in Westeros. Chivalry might be a great idea, but in reality, chivalrous rulers are far and few between. Finally, I do think some of the frustration of the story comes from it clearly not being finished. What do I mean? Well, the game only ever got one season, and only one season was ever released. It's not likely that we'll ever get more, but it's clear from the way that the story is written that there is every intention for the story to continue, to build up and rise with the second season, to finish or resolve some of the story's elements that are in the first season. One of the themes of the story has been about the rise from adversity. Many characters struggle with this. Ethan is trying to become a lord, but he doesn't know how. Roderick is trying to overcome his physical trauma, but he's incredibly hurt. Asher is trying to overcome the emotional and physical scars of his past. It makes sense, then, that the house itself would also have to be struggling, and it falls. But in falling, it gives us an opportunity for the house to rise again, because of course, the chosen lord that you chose, either Roderick or Asher, survives. It means that there will always be a rise that was going to follow after this fall. Narratively, it makes sense because they were hopefully going to expand in a Season 2 or maybe even a Season 3. House Forrester falls, but it's only because we needed to have an opportunity to see them rise again. That, I think, is a huge missed opportunity for this game, and I can't necessarily fault someone for feeling that way. That's ultimately nothing to do with the game itself, and more to do with the mismanagement of the studio that produced it. I do feel that a big part of the story can be enjoyed as its own thing, as its own complete story. Not every story necessarily has a happy ending. Some of my favorites end in somber and uncertain ways. I think that, in a large sense, the story delivers on the emotional sentiments, on its feelings in the best possible way, and you can still feel like you've had a complete story, even if the story itself is not complete. We are made to care about the Forresters. We are made to care for them by being them, by guiding them through their struggles. They, and by extension we, the player, do the best that we can, but we're small fish in a big pond. We can't change the current, we can't change the tide, but at least we can try to swim. In the end, that struggle is what makes the story meaningful, not its destination. Thank you all for listening. Remember to like and subscribe and all that good stuff. Please let me know what you think of this video in the comments. It's definitely a bit different from my usual fare, but I had a lot of fun making it. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.